Welcome. This is WEBA's Conversations. I'm Paul Friedman, your host. I am the vice president for WEBA, the West End Business Association in Alexandria. I'm also an Alexandria Democratic precinct captain and the founder and executive director of a gun violence prevention nonprofit based in Alexandria called Safer Country. Thrilled to have you all here today, or if you're watching on video in the future, we hope you enjoy this opportunity to hear a conversation with the incumbent Democratic representative for the 8th District of Virginia, Don Beyer. Let's now welcome Don Beyer.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you for a whole hour.
It's exciting. It's very exciting. And so let's start, Don, with a little bit of background because people move into our district and may not know your full background over the years. Let me just start by saying that you served for 8 years as lieutenant governor of our state. You served for 4 years as ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And then in 2014, ran and won a seat here in the 8th district. And you've been serving in that seat ever since and are approaching now your opportunity to run for your 5th term as a member of Congress. You also serve as the chair of the Joint Economic Committee, which I hope you'll share a bit about and what you're doing in that role. But before I go any further, though, I want to give you a chance to offer a little bit more depth about your background and how you came to this position.
Yeah, well, I'm old enough that I can take the whole hour, but
let's try to keep it short if we can.
The bottom line is that my grandparents came to Washington in the 20s and 30s to work for the federal government. And my grandmother had 50 years with the Department of Labor and USAID. And my grandfather, one was Department of Interior, the other was Department of Labor and Department of War then. And so I was sort of raised with Potomac fever and this deep sense of public service. I'm an Army brat. My dad was West Point and career military police officer. So I lived a lot of different places, born overseas. And most of my non-political adult life, I've been in retail automobile business, a business that my dad started, and then with my brother and 2 of my sisters, and I was the oldest and therefore sort of the lead dog. We built 49 years coming up in October. But by the time I was early 30s, also realized that as fulfilling as that was, you had a greater responsibility to your community also. And so in 40 years of politics, I've only been in elective office maybe 16 of those years, and the other 24 we're trying to help other people. And I find political life across the spectrum incredibly fulfilling because we get to be, or trying to be, change agents to make people's lives better, the world a different and better place every single day.
Well, that's a great overview. Let me start with a philosophical question because I know you appreciate that. And we started this with your opponent, the challenger, Victoria Veerasinghe, in last week's show. And that show is available online for those who want to watch it. And what I offered her at the start was the Voltaire quote, "The perfect should not be the enemy of the good." I know it's a quote that you're familiar with. It's pretty popular in Washington. It sort of focuses people's attention on the idea of compromise. And I brought up with her the question of the Build Back Better bill and the infrastructure bill that you had a chance to vote on. Actually, you only had a chance to vote on, well, you had a chance to vote on 2, but you did not get a chance to vote on a final version for the Build Back Better bill. And that's sort of the heart of the question. The progressives at the time were saying we won't get a chance to pass the Build Back Better bill if we pass the infrastructure bill first. People who were concerned about this combination wanted to break it off and get the infrastructure bill, lock it in, and said, well, we'll work it out. We'll negotiate. We'll get to that. We haven't gotten to it. So the question is, are we going to get to it? Do you think? And if not, do you think that the strategy that the progressives offered was correct in retrospect?
Really good question and sophisticated. With no perfect wisdom. Back to the line that perfect is the enemy of the good enough. Yeah, and usually the perfect isn't the perfect anyway. You may think it's the perfect, and then later you'll find out everything that was wrong with it. My dad used to put it a little differently. He'd say you never grow broke taking a profit. If you sell a car and make $25, it's not as good as selling it and making $200, but it's still better than nothing. So I'm a member of the Progressive Caucus. I went to most of those meetings with people like Pramila Jayapal, who is a dear friend. But I was also pretty vocal that I thought it was the wrong strategy. I still think it was the wrong strategy. We possibly, I don't want to say we definitely lost the McAuliffe election because we didn't pass infrastructure in the summer, but it certainly didn't help. What we had was a picture of Democrats in disarray. We denied the president a victory on infrastructure until after the McAuliffe election. There's nothing to talk about. People will say there was other things wrong, other things at play, critical race theory, et cetera, but it was a missed opportunity. But I've been negotiating car sales for almost 50 years. And the bottom line has always been, you have to find a win-win proposition. People have to feel good about the deal, or they're going to regret it right away. And that's not where we were. When the progressives were threatening the moderates like a Biden or a Sinema and say, you can't have this till we have that. All it did was harden the opposition. It made it more and more and more difficult. I think we would have been better off passing the infrastructure bill right away, giving Democrats a win, president a win, and then moving on to negotiate Build Back Better. We certainly wouldn't be any worse than we are right now. That's history.
Okay,
let me add one more. That could be wrong too, but clearly
let me add one more
that
thought
progressive strategy didn't work. So.
All right, Don, let me add one more thought. It appeared from the outside looking in that perhaps the infrastructure bill did not face the kind of difficult negotiation it might have had people known that Build Back Better would not move on, that some things they wanted to include were left out, and the belief that they would be added later. Do you think we lost any important elements in the infrastructure bill that should have been fought for at that time, given the situation we're in now?
There's all that tricky language in there, Paul. Yes, we should have fought for it, but you got to realize we had a 50-50 Senate with Kamala Harris breaking the vote, but it wasn't 50-50 ideologically. We got as much. First of all, the House bill was much better. Peter DeFazio, who led the House Transportation Infrastructure, was tearing his hair out with the Senate version that came back. But the Senate version that came back, because that's all they could get in the Senate, that they needed 60 votes. And so you're going to sacrifice a lot of stuff when you have that blankety blank filibuster out there. And when you have only a 50-50 majority. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we should have been in it. I don't think holding up, ignoring Build Back Better to fight to get it all in the infrastructure bill would have gotten us anything. We remember that the people on the Hill on both sides are not amateur negotiators. It isn't like you can go in and be persuasive and flip them around. It's hard to change people's minds up there. You don't do it by debate anyway.
I hear you. There are quite a few people in the country who don't really understand how Washington works, I think it's safe to say. And they think the president has enormous power, really almost dictatorial power in a way. They think that if he says, I want to get something done, that's all it takes. They don't recognize the difficulties of working with Congress. And do you find that that's going to be a problem for you and for members of Congress who are in the so-called majority, who a lot of people are frustrated? They feel like perhaps the president should have achieved things that he hasn't achieved. How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, it's real, Paul. I mean, let me give you the A and the B. On the A side, president after president has been frustrated with their inability to get things done through Congress. Our mutual friend Norm Ornstein wrote a book on Congress called "It's Worse Than It Looks." And so, you've had all these different presidents: George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Trump, now to a lesser extent Joe Biden, doing lots and lots of executive orders, only because that's the only way they can move the ball down the field. They would rather do it through Congress, but if Congress isn't going to pass anything, what do you end up doing? For example, right now, the student debt relief. Most everybody wants at least some of it. My progressive caucus would say at least $50,000 per person. The more moderate would say at least $10,000 per person. But right now, Joe Biden has got to try to figure out how to do it through executive order, because he's certainly not getting a piece of congressional legislation to do it. On the other hand, one of the things from an institutionalist perspective, as a member of Congress, as a member of the legislative branch, we have to be worried about how more and more of the power that should be ours is moving to the president. And it's moving because we can't do our job. And I don't want to pick on anybody, but the House does this job regardless. When John Boehner and Paul Ryan were Speaker, they passed 400 pieces of legislation. I didn't like a lot of them, but they passed them. And now with Nancy Pelosi, we pass a lot of good legislation. But it goes to the Senate and it dies. And the number one reason it dies is they have a filibuster that is not in the Constitution. It's not even in the Senate rules. It's a tradition that emerged to stop civil rights, to stop African Americans from voting and having economic power. And until we get rid of that, it's really difficult to see how you're going to make Congress a functioning institution again.
I want to take that up, and I want to take up some other questions with regard to the power of the presidency. But before I do want to inject an important note here. You have an opponent. This is a Democratic nomination fight, the opportunity to represent the 8th District for the Democrats. And your opponent's primary argument, or an important argument for her, I believe, from listening to her in past debates, is that she's a person of color and that it's time the district be represented by a person of color. How do you feel about that?
Well, I certainly am thrilled that there are many more people of color, and not just African Americans, but Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. We have way more women than we had a generation ago. We now have a huge LGBT caucus. It is wonderful that we have ever more people representing ever different slices of America who've been left out, now serving not just in Congress, but in public life. So I respect that. However, I'm never going to be an African American, and so I can't be that. In the meantime, I can work as hard as I can for people who have been underrepresented. For example, as you remember, Paul, I was on the ticket with Doug Wilder, with the nation's first elected Black governor in 1989. And he helped me over the top with an awful lot of people. I like to think I helped him over the top with an awful lot of Northern Virginians. And I spent 2 years of my life full-time for free on Barack Obama's campaign. And I led the Mid-Atlantic finance for him. He raised a crazy amount of money. And I was in Grant Park the night he got sworn in, or the night he was elected. Everybody was in tears around us. And I look at the way in my own life as an older white man, of Danish and Estonian extraction. Two of my three chiefs of staff have been African Americans. All through the team, both in my personal life and my political life and in the business life, we've tried to make sure that as many people representing all these often ignored minorities are elevated into positions of leadership and in good income and the like. So, I can't be African American or Hispanic or anything else, but I can do the best I can as a white man to make sure that I'm doing all I can to make sure that they have a voice and are included. And my other response is that, and this is with all respect to my opponent, is that there are a lot of people in the 8th District of Northern Virginia who had spent decades in public service, in volunteer service, in elected office, in appointed office, that are also from traditionally underrepresented groups, who would be more than worthy successors to me. And I hope when the time comes for me to hang this up, that many of them are interested in it also.
Excellent. Well, we have some critical issues that face
I
America.
back up 1 second too. I also think it's really important to say that having an important credential, like representing the Black community, representing the Latino community, that is really, really important. But you should also have all the other credentials that come with it, which is a real deep commitment to community service, to the people, a legacy of accomplishment. So we know where your heart is, where your mind is. And
yes, the experience can be critical in getting the most out of your service. And of course, in a very short time, 2 years at a time, it takes a great deal of understanding of the nuance of the work you're doing to be able to get the most out of it for your constituents. And along those lines, you've been doing work in terms of getting more things for the 8th District as a result of a change in the way Washington operates. We had gotten rid of the idea of designating things on behalf of members of Congress. Now you're once again getting an opportunity to get some projects for the district. Can you tell us how you've done in that regard?
Well, I was thrilled. I never thought getting rid of earmarks made a lot of sense. First of all, we'd all bash the bridge to nowhere in Alaska, but the percentage of the federal budget that went to earmarks was always like way less than 1%. I think I'd seen numbers as small as 1/10 of 1%. And when you think about allocating money to specific projects, and if I have the responsibility to invest in a given thing and it's a bad idea, people can criticize me, throw me out, vote against me, run against me. But if somebody deep within the bureaucracy makes a bad decision, there's rarely going to be any accountability. Plus, I would argue typically if you're active in public life as elected official, I mean, you're out every day, you're out every night, and you have a pretty good sense of where the need is going to be because you're listening to people all day. Paul, as you know, last year for the first time, we got to identify 10 earmarks. I think they're called community special projects. And we didn't quite know where to go because there were 1,000 nonprofits in Northern Virginia. Really difficult to pick 10 of those 1,000 as the most worthy. So we went to the Alexandria City Council and the Arlington County Board and the like, and said, "What do you need?" It was fun. I was at Falls Church's high school, which is called Meridian now, on Friday afternoon to celebrate their new electric buses. One of our earmarks was to build the electrical charging system for their buses, which is incredibly helpful for, throwaway statistics, 600,000 school buses in America, 97% run on diesel fuel. Bad for the kids, bad for the environment, certainly bad when gas prices are high. So Falls Church has made the transition, and our little earmark helped that. Here in Alexandria, we got money for body cameras for the Alexandria Police. In Arlington, something that is really close to my heart, we're able to use the earmarks to fund a mental health unit as an adjunct to the Arlington Police. So when they get a call of somebody who's in a psychiatric, frenzy for whatever reason, maybe barricaded in a home or wandering naked in a street or whatever in between, you don't have to go there with guns ablaze to do it. You can go there with a mental health unit to take the first lead with police only as a backup. So we have 15 this year, Paul, that we've asked for, and we hope. Rosa DeLauro is the chair of our appropriations committee. I love her, but I try to stay really good friends with her because we want all 15 to be funded if possible.
Well, you've spoken about a few issues that relate to crime, and crime is a rising problem in America. We can't ignore that. I don't hear a lot of Democrats discussing that nationally about a strategy. I know that in the 90s we had a crime bill. It's now in recent years, it's been criticized a great deal, although at the time it was very well received, if I recall. And everybody wanted it, including the Black community, led by the Black Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus. But there obviously were flaws in that measure, perhaps. And so the question now is, what should we do? And before I give you a chance to answer that fully, I just want to share a quick story. I recently heard from a fellow Alexandrian Black woman whose nephew was shot. It was a case of mistaken identity. It's in another part of the state. and he's now in the hospital waiting for special surgery for his jaw. It's going to be a very expensive experience, and it's a very disheartening experience that people are being shot by gangs and others randomly in our country. We know what happened in Buffalo. We can get to that in a moment too. But and there are a lot of gun laws we'd like to pass to perhaps could help address the crime issue. Do you have a crime agenda? And should that crime agenda, I'm going to throw this at you, should that crime agenda include paying the medical bills for people injured in these crimes, because they're enormous on people? So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Paul, you open up again so many different avenues to pursue. Probably the most important crime bill that is my direct responsibility is the Cost of Police Misconduct Act. And this came out of the NYU policing reform unit, a really interesting group of people. And the Cost of Police Misconduct Act, and I think I have 50 some co-sponsors right now, trying to get to 100 by the end of the year, would require state and local governments to make public, to your show, to the Alexandria papers, to the Washington Post, and specifically to the U.S. Attorney General every year, how much money they spent fixing police misconduct cases, police brutality, false arrest, whatever. It's in the billions and billions of dollars. I think Chicago alone is about $500 million a year. And we look at that and we want the taxpayers to know what we're spending and say, what about if we spent that money on better policing, on higher police salaries, on higher standards for police, on better management, on disaggregating the police function? We'd be way better off. I really struggled with why the surge in crime, and I try to read everything I can about it. A lot of different factors. The biggest one is we're post-pandemic, and people are really struggling with all the confusion and the angst. You've seen that our young people, the Gen Y, Gen Z, have more depression and anxiety than any generation ever before, at least measured. But also, mostly, it's young men shooting young men, and people dying accidentally along the way. And say, why doesn't this happen in England or France or Germany or Switzerland or many other places? And the big difference is the 400 million guns that we have in American hands. I know Safer Country is all about trying to find some common sense gun solutions. There are a bunch out there. Universal background checks, which we passed in the House and dies in the Senate. Stopping high capacity magazines, passed in the House, dies in the Senate. I'm a big fan of red flag laws, the emergency, what do you call them, EROs? The
ERPOs.
ERPOs, yeah.
Right, a protective order by a court to remove guns in advance when someone is found by a judge to be a danger to themselves or others. And it's now in 19 states, as you know, in the District of Columbia. It's in New York. There's concern that it should have been used in the Buffalo case, Absolutely. But it wasn't used. And now the governor has issued an executive order removing the discretion by the police in that case. Is that something that might influence the way you craft legislation?
Well, I love ERPOs, and with Salud Carbajal, who is a member of Congress from Southern California, he represents the district where that young man, his parents had turned him in 3 times to the police. And 3 times the police said, well, yeah, let him go. And he ended up, buying guns legal and then shooting a bunch of young women because they weren't, they never paid attention to him. It's really necessary. But Paul, larger picture, and I don't know how to, what the first or second or third steps are, is changing this unique gun culture in the United States. I know my Republican friends think freedom is the most important value above all, but the freedom to have all these indiscriminate murders through the course of the year, or as you know well, 2/3 of suicides are gun suicides, which tend to be completed on the first try. It's interesting, Paul, as you know, the percentage of families, households that have guns continues to decline slowly, but the number of guns per household that have guns continues to increase quickly. And through the pandemic, and even when something like what happens in Buffalo last week, you find more and more people who never wanted to have guns, a Hispanic family or Black family will go out and buy them because they're so afraid. So changing this culture is going to take maybe generations, but we have to keep working at it. And thank you for all of your leadership to move us in that direction.
I only play a small role, but I'm doing what I can. There are 400 million guns and 300 million people. It's a lot to take on. No other country in the world has this sort of proliferation of guns in its society, and easy to acquire. The lack of the comprehensive background checks. We have loopholes in that system, as you mentioned, that create some of this problem, certainly. And of course, I think both candidates here are probably agreed about the essence of that problem. But I did mention the healthcare thing. I do want to get back to that. Do you support national health insurance for the country? And if not, would you want to make sure we at least take care of crime victims?
Let me back up for 1 second to the guns because it's relevant. There was a bill passed in the 2004, 2005 when the Republicans controlled everything that took away liability from the gun manufacturers. And they're basically the only people that can't be sued. You can sue doctors, you can sue lawyers, you can sue politicians, but you can't sue gun manufacturers. And the ability to sue the tobacco companies made a world of difference in terms of moving people off of cigarettes and actually causing tobacco companies to diversify, to start selling, chicken and craft foods and things like that. We're now only Australia has a smaller percentage of its citizens smoking than we do. We've come a long, long way, and being able to sue the gun or the cigarette manufacturers was part of that. So if we can sue the gun makers, that will go at least part of the way towards paying for all the health care from the gun victims. In the meantime, yes, I support Medicare for all. For at least 30 years, I've been a strong supporter of universal health care. The shorthand is, how can we be the richest nation in the history of mankind and not be able to pay for health care for our citizens? Besides, most of the rest of the world does. We lived in Switzerland for 4 years. Everybody had health care. When one of my daughters, her spring break was in London many years ago, and she thought she had appendicitis. She spent a week in a London hospital, and at the end had a $50 bill. And that was not on our insurance. And these stories are all over. It's amazing that we can't figure out how to do it. And we can. Teddy Kennedy had the simple idea some years ago. You just drop the Medicare age 1 year every year. And before you know it, everybody's covered. And the Build Back Better bill that hasn't passed yet, I think we dropped the Medicare age from 65 to 58. And then also included health care, dental care, eye care, ear care, hearing aids in Medicare, which right now is sort of amazing that they aren't covered. I had, before the pandemic, I had a root canal. So I went over to this wonderful doctor on King Street, and I think it was $1,650 or something. I mean, it did a really good job, but it was expensive. I thought, what if I'd been a senior citizen on Medicare, getting my $800 Social Security check? It'd take me 2 months just to pay for the root canal. And what am I going to eat in the meantime? We have a long way to go, but we can do it, and we should do it. Let me give you one other car dealer story. So selling cars for all these years, all through the 80s, we watched as the Japanese crept up on the American manufacturers. Toyota, Honda, Nissan were taking over from General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. What few people mentioned was that they had a $2,000 to $3,000 cost advantage per car because Japan had universal health care, and in Detroit, the manufacturers had to pay for it through the union contracts wages for it. That's a huge amount. I mean, you could have a different situation in American manufacturing today if we just been smart enough to have universal health care.
Now, Democrats are talking about running on the abortion issue, and that is a healthcare issue, as we know. And we're very concerned that the Supreme Court will probably in the next few weeks issue a holding by one of the most radical justices we've ever had in Alito on this measure. But I'd like to know why it is we're not arguing. I would want your opinion about that and what we could do about the Supreme Court. And let me just throw out to you, should we be considering impeaching some of these justices for their positions that they articulated in the Senate hearings? or at least adding to the Supreme Court to try to overcome these extremist justices. We have to know your opinions on those things. But beyond that, the messaging for Democrats coming in November, should it include not just the abortion issue, which is, I think, critical, but also the issues you just described, all those healthcare issues that Americans need to be addressed and are not being addressed.
Yeah, we need to talk about all of that. Absolutely. Although, Paul, as you know, everywhere I go, everywhere you go, people complain about Democratic messaging. And part of the complaint of Democratic messaging is we have too much to talk about.
Yeah.
Just listen to my answers, right? And we have to be smart enough, wise enough. I hope the world isn't clever enough to come up with the compact answer that includes all of those ideas. Not make America great again, but something that people understand. We're talking about preserving a woman's right to have a safe, affordable abortion. We're concerned. We're going to try to make happen universal health care. We're going to try to make sure that that the 1% of guns that are used wrongly to kill other people are reduced. Fascinating statistic, which I'm sure you know. My daughter, who teaches me everything, said that something like 10% of the gun shops in America sell the guns used in 70% of the crimes. So wouldn't it be interesting to use the ATF to focus on those 10%? Not necessarily to drive them out of business, just to make sure that they have really enhanced security measures about who they're selling the guns to and where those guns are going.
Well, we can't get a director approved in the Senate for the ATF. And
the last one was approved, what, 2004, 2005?
Long time ago. One might consider the Republicans having an anti-crime agenda, or a pro-crime agenda, perhaps I should say. They may have a pro-crime agenda. They don't want to put someone in charge of the ATF. They don't want to make sure that every gun has a serial number on it so it can be tracked. There are a number of other measures that they don't want to take that would help us fight crime. Is there an argument there that you might want to message in the coming months if you're elected as the nominee in the party?
Yeah, for 7 years ago, I introduced the ATF Act. Has a fancier name than that, but it just addressed all those things that you said. There are more federally licensed firearm dealers in America than there are McDonald's. They're supposed to get a review, in-person review from an ATF agent once a year. The average is once every 10 years. Haven't had an ATF director, as you say, in almost 17 years. It needs to be much, much stronger than it is right now. Of course, if you're NRA, you want the ATF to be as weak as possible. You don't want any regulation because it's about freedom. And what we want is, once again, responsible freedom. And a strong ATF would help move us in that direction.
So
on the Supreme Court, by the way,
yes.
Again, back in 2014, I was first campaigning. Among my platforms was term limits, 18 years, staggered terms. This is an idea developed decades and decades ago by some smart law professors. It's crazy that right now we have people hang on until they can barely walk, or we try to nominate the youngest person we can. Some of these people could serve 50, 60 years. You need healthy turnover. You also need to not be locked into anyone, especially far right-wing ideological bias for decade after decade after decade.
Democrats believe that Mitch McConnell stole a Supreme Court appointment.
He did. Yeah, absolutely stole.
What is the penalty for that?
But we're not going to impeach the justice because he did it. I don't know
the consequence. Whether they were honest about their position on Roe v. Wade. Do you think that these senators, when they spoke to senators, I mean, we have a Republican woman senator, Susan Collins, who says that she was lied to. Do you think that was the case?
If Susan Collins says she was lied to, I believe her. I'm sure she's disappointed too.
Yeah.
But I am reluctant to endorse impeaching Supreme Court justices. Again, it seems to me to be too much invasion into the separation of powers. Also, the reality is that there is a significant plurality, hardly a majority, of Americans who agree with where they are. So to impeach them for their ideological views, however much I disagree with them, I think takes the democracy in the wrong step. Limiting their terms to 18 years would be good. If we could get enough votes to expand the court, that also would be fine with me.
Okay.
But Paul, it all comes back to the notion that elections have consequences. When we can't elect enough of our own people, which by the way, forgive me for taking us in that direction, but that original compromise that allowed us to form the United States of America, members of the House by population, proportional, and senators 2 per state, has given us a situation where an ever smaller number of people will be electing a majority. I think the numbers by 2030, 30% of American people will elect 70% of the senators. And those 30% are going to be older, whiter, more conservative, more rural, more Christian. I mean, if you're all those things, it might sound pretty good, but it's not going to be representative of America. And right now, the thought that 2 senators from North Dakota have as much power as 2 senators from California makes no sense whatsoever. And that, again, is part of the reason why it is so difficult to get anything done in Congress.
I want to pursue that question of democracy and our structure in just a moment, but I'm going to intercede here with one question, more local question that I know you've had an interest in, and I think will also be of interest to the public in our district. The Washington Commanders are considering moving to Northern Virginia, and there may be some federal involvement in that. I understand you have opposed that. Could you explain your position?
Well, if I have anything to do with it, there'll be no federal involvement. And I think it's one of the rare cases where our Republican colleagues should agree with me that it makes, every time a state throws tons of tax dollars at building big sports arenas and stadiums and the like, it ends up being an economic loser for the state or the city. And I just don't think when we have so many needs out there, that we should be spending scarce federal tax dollars to build someone like Dan Snyder a new stadium. He just bought a $48 million house right down the Parkway. I mean, he's a billionaire. LA Rams just built a new stadium. They did it with private money. They did it with their own money. They've shown the way to go. I know the General Assembly, Governor Youngkin, et cetera, they may have a different opinion. I don't serve there. If they asked me my opinion, I'd say I'll let the private sector build it, but I certainly, I'm leading legislation in the House to deny the tax deductibility, which is what happens with municipal bonds, for bonds used to build sports facilities.
Okay. And what about just continuing on the business trend for a moment, because we are the West End Business Association. Your thoughts on small businesses, how you are working to help them in the district and perhaps beyond, and particularly with regard to the federal government. I hear that there are small businesses that would like to be able to do more business with the federal government, find it difficult. How have you been addressing that?
Well, first, the good news is that there was a huge surge in small business startups in 2021. I think more new small business startups than at any time in history, including pre-pandemic. And it's amazing, Paul, one of the good news is so many of them are being started by new Americans, Hispanic Americans especially. And that's really exciting because that will redound through the generations as their kids, if they don't take over the business, at least they learn the business and they grow it, and it'll be pretty cool. Specifically on federal contracting, one of the, I think, bad trends that we've seen is that there are, while there are many federal contractors out there, an increasing percentage of the bids are being concentrated in just 4 or 5 companies. Where a generation ago, it may have been 20 companies, and 2 generations ago, it may have been 100 companies. So those big 4 or 5 win all the contracts out, then they dice out little by little to some of the subs. Those subs need to be able to be direct beneficiaries of those contracts or responsibility for those contracts. In a worst case, I've heard this story too many times. I get a woman-owned business or a minority-owned business who's attracted to be part of the coalition of the big guys to make the contract. and make it all look pretty and fair and equalized and diverse. But then when the money's actually spent, none of it flows to those small businesses. So if they can go directly, so let's, instead of letting a $1 billion contract, why not let, $5 million contracts or however the math works.
Can you also,
zeros there for me? So.
Would you support an office that is dedicated to helping small businesses interact with the federal government more effectively?
Well, the first thing I'd support would be looking at the offices that are already supposed to be doing that.
Uh-huh.
There's one in Department of Commerce that's specifically about small business for underserved communities, underrepresented communities. And I know Department of Defense, among others, NASA, have specific units in there that are supposed to do small business. So probably the first thing to do would be to say, are they working? If they're not, what's wrong? Rather than, and then if we need to pull them all together into one place, maybe that's smart.
I see a lot of signs for people, small businesses, seeking workers, seeking people to work in their businesses. They're struggling to find people. And at the same time, we have a lot of people from south of the border coming to America, searching for economic stability and success, and are being rebuffed in a number of ways. Desperately living in Mexico, perhaps being treated miserably while they're there. We need to solve the border problem. We need to solve the employment problem. Do you see a linkage there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So sorry for throwing all these numbers at you, but I'm a business guy. We have 11.5 million jobs advertised today. It's the most ever in American history. We've never had this many empty jobs. We have roughly 5 million people that are looking for work. So that's a more than 2-to-1 ratio. We've never had a ratio that big before, ever. Twice as many jobs as the people. Now, the dilemma, of course, is that a lot of those 5 million people, they either live in the wrong place or they don't have the specific skill sets to be a cybersecurity chief, or they want at $7.25 an hour, they're not going to work for that. They can't make ends meet. So there are lots of things we can do to fix it. One of the very first, though, is could he get some comprehensive immigration reform? And there are many different pieces of it, but here's a number. During the Trump years, we were allowing 250,000 legal immigrants a year. For the many, many years before that, we were doing 1 million plus. So we were starving ourselves of the talent we need to take those jobs. And by the way, no surprise, our new Americans, our immigrant workers, are always among the best workers in any business that we see. And solving the situation at the border is a piece of that.
Now, a judge recently ruled that the president could not end Rule 42, which was a health measure regarding COVID. That we don't know how much longer that will stay in effect. But should that provision be ended the way the president wants, or should it be extended the way even some Democrats want, because they don't feel the country is prepared necessarily to take on the influx expected of people coming once they see that measure go away?
The answer is yes. Both are true. I think the president morally and legally doesn't have much choice but to try to remove the Title 42 restriction. Because Title 42 was put there not because we were overwhelmed at the border. He put there because of a health concern. And if the CDC determines the health concern no longer justifies it, then the right thing to do, the legal thing to do, is to withdraw Title 42. Now, having said that, we also have to be eyes wide open. There will then be a lot more surge at the border than we already have. And it's going to require ever greater efforts on the part of the federal government to manage that. But that's also just the reality. And
does the president have the financial? I'm sorry,
people back this year.
Don, if I may, does the president have the capacity to provide the financial wherewithal to deal with this on his own, or is that something Congress needs to do?
It's probably a mix. And there's certainly, as we saw with Donald Trump taking defense money and spending it on the wall, there are certainly things that can be reallocated to make this happen. And the real challenge is, by the way, what's fascinating, Paul, is I had a big meeting the other day with a number of the immigration leaders in the House and the Senate. Dick Durbin and Alex Padilla, both senators, came over who've been deeply involved in this. And we can probably talk in a little while about what we need to invest in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, overcoming the corruption and the crime rates and the sexual assault rates. But the number one group that's appearing at the border right now is from Mexico. And the number two is from Cuba, and the number three is from Ukraine. So rather than coming from Central America, what's happening at the border, and a couple of months ago, it was Ethiopians. It's changing all the time. And it's because the motivations, economic, family, danger, bona fide asylum are so diverse and meaningful. It's I don't envy Alex Padilla at all, our Secretary of Homeland Security. That's got to be the most difficult job in America. But just because it's the most difficult doesn't mean that we don't have to do it and do it really well. You train with respect, and care, and you send the people back who don't qualify for asylum, and the people you do. By the way, one of the huge problems that we need is we have a 1 million backlog case in the immigration courts. And it reminds me of those when you show up at Dulles and the line's 2 hours long. Say a head should roll somewhere, in terms of the management. If you can get those 1 million immigration cases done through the courts, you either get them resettled in the United States legally or you send them back legally, but you move on rather than everybody in stasis and people spread out across the country without papers.
Well, this, of course, is another difficult thing to explain in messaging, and especially when you have one side saying Democrats are for open borders, and
which is silly. I mean, Joe Biden's people have turned away a million people. I think Barack Obama actually repatriated to their home countries more citizens than any president in our lives.
He was known as the deporter in chief to many, right?
Yeah. And so this open border stuff is just nonsense. By the way, one of the things that the Republicans like to think it's all about swimming the Rio Grande. The vast majority of the asylum seekers walk across the bridges, San Diego, Ciudad Juarez, places like that, and present themselves for asylum. They're not middle of the night stuff. They're coming here. My life is terrible, and I'm in danger back home, and I seek asylum in the United States. So. Well, and then this whole notion that my Republican pals about the fentanyl coming in, it's coming in at the major ports of entries in trucks that are waved through by customs because they can only check a small percentage of the trucks, and they're not on the backpack of somebody swimming the Rio Grande. So yes, it is a huge problem, but it is not a problem that a wall will ever help, or more Customs Border Patrol agency.
This is going to be a real tough question, but we have a drug war going on that's, I think, generally considered failed for the last, since the Nixon administration, perhaps. What would you do if you could to address that issue and all the crime that's related to it, and the no-knock warrants that are an example of the police trying to pursue drug criminals?
Well, our George Floyd justice and policing bill that we passed a couple of years ago, again, didn't go anywhere in the Senate, of course. Very good piece of legislation, which banned not only chokeholds, but banned no-knock warrants also, except in the most extreme situations, because there have been just tragedy after tragedy, as we know, Breonna Taylor and much more. I've long been a supporter of legalizing marijuana. And right now, one of the struggles we have is we keep passing in the House legislation to allow federal banking for the marijuana receipts in the shops, and the Republicans in the Senate keep killing it. So you have all these places in Colorado and Oregon and stuff are all cash, which means they're sadly great places to launder money or attract organized crime, or people getting killed as they rob them on the way to wherever they're storing it. But I think we have to also be clear-eyed and say, just because we legalize marijuana or decriminalize it in a lot of places, doesn't mean we've solved the drug cartel problem. Because beyond marijuana, there's still meth and heroin and fentanyl and a lot of other really bad stuff. I don't know that I can give you a precise answer. Fentanyl is, I think, the thing that most concerns me right now because it is so deadly. Meth was going to be deadly over a 2-year period of time, but the fentanyl will kill you right away.
It's
Paul,
funny how the country.
Go ahead. But
John, it's funny how the country judged the character of certain people in this country poorly for taking certain drugs. But when a vast majority of white people in middle America started dying from overdoses of fentanyl and other, no longer the character was the issue. Now the issue is how do we provide health care? What do you think of that?
I think it's racist. I think it's a terrible thing. But it's like, why are we surprised? Yeah. That was all the difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, right? Where the crack, which was seen to be used by minority communities, have much longer prison sentences than the powder, which all the kids were doing at their Ivy League colleges. So I think we're overcoming that. But yeah.
Moving on a little bit in the healthcare area here, a recent report from England, a medical journal, indicated that approximately 400,000 Americans died as a result of COVID who didn't have to die, had this been handled differently in our country. And we know, I don't have to repeat the entire saga of the president at the time admitting in an interview with the Washington Post reporter, which he knew he was being taped, saying that he wanted to play down the danger of COVID, and later suggested a variety of ways to address it, which were incomprehensible and even more dangerous. And now, of course, I don't hear enough people talking about that responsibility and what it's led to in the country. Do you think that should be discussed more often?
Yeah, we have a lot more to talk about because this is not the last pandemic. And we already are, monkeypox is out there. We're reading about that every day. Paul, we had 4 or 5 major pandemics in the last decade. They're coming much more frequently because we're pushing 8 billion people on the planet. We're living everywhere. There's a lot more interaction with animals than ever before. So we've got to be ready for this. We should have been ready for COVID-19. There have been a lot of people out there warning us ahead of time,
actually, John, President Barack Obama warned the nation about it and set up a department in the White House to address it, which was dismantled when the next president came into power. We need a country that's devoted to science. Do you think that's a significant issue in the coming election, in the fall election? Do you think it should be?
Oh, I definitely think it should be. Back to those 400,000, the dilemma there, and I don't know how many of them of those 400,000 deaths, you can attribute to not being vaccinated. But I bet it's a pretty big number. So when you have a president and sadly an infrastructure around Trump that are science deniers, if it was just Bobby Kennedy, it would have been a small little, fringe. But when it's the president of the United States amplified by Fox News and One America and all these other folks, the Alex Joneses of the world, all of a sudden it becomes 30% of America. And you end up with a significant part of the 400,000 that died because they're not vaccinated. Paul, you look at our death rate, our lifespan went down another half year last year. Well, yours went up, mine went up, most of our friends went up, but it was almost all that was attributed to white unvaccinated men in red states. And so those are the ones directly affected by this. Yeah, there were obviously everyone made mistakes along the way. Everyone, we don't have the advantage of, perfect wisdom as we move forward. But boy, I sure hope we learn from it.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, so unfortunately we can't get into the full discussion of foreign policy I'd like about Ukraine and China. I'll just touch on China for a moment since it's in the news. What did you think of the president's remarks about Taiwan? And do you have an opinion about what our policy should be?
I thought it was classic Joe Biden. I don't think it was on his teleprompter or in his script. And I know the White House tried to walk it back a number of times. I'm not president, and I don't have that responsibility. I personally have been much more secure with the so-called strategic ambiguity, that we can appear to look like we're going to defend them militarily, but you don't really know. I know that there's been a vigorous debate in the foreign policy community for a long time about the strategic ambiguity versus the strategic clarity, which says we will defend them militarily. It reminds me a little bit of Barack Obama's red line in Syria on the chemical weapons, that you want to be careful not to paint red lines that you later have to ignore. And I look and say, I want to keep Taiwan free for as long as possible, but I do worry about how do you take on militarily a country that's, I don't know, was it 10,000, 12,000 miles away, that has 5 times your population and a stronger and bigger economy. We are incredibly powerful militarily. And is that going to be the, I don't know. It's just, I think it's really complicated, but I'm not president. And hopefully,
yeah.
It's clear they said that Joe Biden has done that that same statement. He's made it a number of times before. I don't think he made a mistake. I don't think he misspoke. And like poor George Bush, who said Iraq was a great disaster, meaning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. I think he actually meant it, but I do think it might have been a surprise to some of those around him.
We have a little time left, and in that time, I'm going to talk about democracy. Many Democrats believe that democracy is at a tipping point, potentially, and this election could be that tipping point. Most Americans don't know who Kevin McCarthy is or his allegiance to Donald Trump. Only the people who pay closest attention appear to understand what may happen if Democrats lose the majority. We also see an election today, a primary election in Georgia, that could lead to a Secretary of State being nominated by the Republicans, who would have handed as many votes as Donald Trump wanted in order to win that state, regardless of whether they existed. What are your thoughts about the future of democracy, and should that be the top issue, perhaps, or is it not? Do people not care enough to make it the top issue in this coming November election?
I don't think people are scared enough. I also think the issue is generally not who gets to vote, voter ID laws, things like that. I'm thrilled by the reports that our early turnout in Georgia is surging, despite their new laws. Much more concerning is who gets to count the votes. You put, for example, Jody Hice, who I don't admire in any way, is a member of Congress. He's the one who tried to rename Gravelly Point after Nancy Reagan here at National Airport. We successfully fought him back. I threatened to name a park in his district after Bernie Sanders and slowed it down.
I'm a little more concerned about his willingness to hand over 11,000.
Well, if he wins today, he would. That's the real fear is, we're trying to get an electoral count act going in a bipartisan way that would prevent a vice president from spinning it. But you do have to, it's not an accident that so many of the Republicans are focusing on these Secretary of State races. It is terrifying. And the only optimistic thing I could say is my deep belief that the American people would not put up with that. But that may be naive. The German people put up with Hitler, and there are a lot of very good Russians who are putting up with Putin right now. So hopefully we would not let them cheat.
Are you frustrated with the slow pace of the Department of Justice with regard to the coup plotters?
Yeah, I am. I was among the letter writers to Attorney General Garland that said, let's go. If there are no consequences to these actions, I think the FBI's done a pretty good job, I think. I have no way to judge overall, taking a lot of the rioters, the insurrectionists, to court. So now we're getting a lot of court cases and things like that, which is helpful. But I would, the people that the House has held in contempt and turned over to the Justice Department for indictment, I'd love to see them indicted and grand juries or whatever is appropriate, take them to trial. Obviously, I've been very disappointed too, and not Merrick Garland's Justice Department, but the Bill Barr before, about their how long it took to look at the Bijan Gaysar case, the park police officers who put 9 bullets in a guy who had done nothing wrong.
We're going to exceed our time just for another couple of minutes, but I want to just ask you whether or not you feel that Congress should be putting restrictions on the power of the president. We learned that there was enormous emergency powers that we don't even fully understand. And if the wrong person were once again to be in a position of power, those powers could even allow him or her to use the military in domestic situations. We already saw something at the near the White House that threatened that very thing. Are you working on that? Or are you concerned about that?
No, I'm very concerned about it. We talked half an hour ago about how much of the executive power had shifted, presidents using much more. So the whole notion that we have gone into country after country after country, ostensibly using that authorization to use military force, AUMF, from 2002 that had to do with Iraq. How are we in Somalia because of that AUMF? My most specific concern, Paul, though, is with the use of nuclear weapons. First of all, for more than 40 years, I've been arguing for a no first use policy for nuclear weapons. We're the only country ever to use them first in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If we believe that they're there as a deterrent, using them first is not a deterrent, right? So far, the Biden administration, Joe Biden in the campaign had a different stake on it, which was no sole use, not no first use, but the sole use would be to defer. But we haven't even gotten that far. But then also you saw, General Milley at the end of the Trump administration terrified that Trump might try to do something crazy like nuke another nation. So that we have pieces of legislation, Congressman Ted Lieu, John Garamendi, and me, to make sure that not just one person can make that decision to use nuclear weapons. But there's a whole panoply of reining in the excess unconstitutional powers of the president in a bill sponsored by John Yarmuth out of Kentucky, which hasn't had a House vote yet and it would go nowhere in the Senate. But it's the right thing for us to be talking about and ultimately doing.
Well, we've had a little more than an hour. I wish we had much more time. Perhaps we can do this again in the future. Let me just ask you to take a moment to make your final pitch to our audience for why you should be elected in the coming primary. Give them the date, any other campaign information you'd like to share.
Well, today is Tuesday, May 24th. So the primary is 4 weeks from today, June 21st, the longest day of the year. It's the only primary in Virginia. We're the only thing on the ballot. If you're watching, I would love your vote. I'd be very appreciative of it. Politics is a lot of different things, but like life, it's muchly about relationship. And the ability to get things done is driven by the quality of relationship you have with the people who have the sticks of power. And not just the speaker and the committee chairs, but your Republican colleagues, the people in the many groups. And I've spent 40 years now trying to serve others in a way that's actually nurtured most of those relationships. So I do feel young at the peak of my political ability to make change. And it's the most fulfilling job I've ever had by far. I'm energized every single morning when I wake up. So I'd like to continue doing it as long as I feel I can do it better than anybody else in this immediate sphere. And but always knowing, we're not irreplaceable. There will be wonderful people who come after me, and I'll do my best to help them.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Congressman Don Beyer, for joining us today for this hour to discuss your campaign for re-election and renomination first. And I think we've more than run out of our time. So with that, I'm going to say thank you on behalf of the West End Business Association. This has been WEBA's Conversations. I'm your host, Paul Friedman. Hope to see you in the future. Take care.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. We're out.